So today it's Dave Sutherland. He is a community naturalist. I think that is a great title to have in your book. And I would really encourage you to go to his website, which is his name, davesutherland.co, because you'll learn a lot. He is the person that you want with you when you're hiking. I am always wondering, oh my gosh, what's that plant? Why is it here? Is it poisonous? Can I eat it? What is it? That's me. I'm sure that if I were on a hike with him, I would drive him crazy. However, he would probably be the best person because he's led outdoor education programs in California, Idaho, Costa Rica, and trained people on the Galapagos Islands, and worked for more than 25 years in Boulder open space. Today, he's going to share some amazing things he's found here in Boulder, and I'm hoping he will answer lots and lots of questions. Will you help me welcome him?
Okay, let's see if I'm live. Can you all hear me? You can all hear me? Okay, great. So what I really want to do today is take you on sort of a virtual nature hike. And so I'm going to have to ask you all to imagine that we can go someplace else, not just physically in space, but in time, because I'm going to take you back to the year 2012, and I'm going to take you on a virtual nature hike of something that happened in the past, something that if you live in Boulder, we all remember, and is something that probably scared the bejesus out of all of us when it happened. So I'm going to take you back to 2012 and the Flagstaff Fire. Does anybody remember this? At the time, I thought it was Armageddon. On June 26th, 2012, a lightning strike on the backside of Flagstaff Mountain started up a fire that was then pushed by wind and burned all the way up the backsides of Bear Peak and South Boulder Peak. It was part of what we considered at the time in fire as sort of a nightmare scenario, because having a bunch of fire on the backside of the mountains with a strong wind behind it could cause raining stuff, a rain of burning material to come over the mountain and fall onto the city. I was tasked with going out and keeping people from hiking into the open space and mountain parks land, because we were concerned that people would go up there trying to get photographs like this and get cut off by burning material raining down behind them. There was an immediate firefighter response to this, and we were very, very lucky in that there was a big fire up in Fort Collins at the time, and so they were able to divert some resources down from that one, including a number of tanker airplanes that came down. They laid down a lot of fire retardant, did water drops on the fire, and within a couple of days they were able to get the fire put completely out. And in the end, it only burned about 300 acres, which, for the fire that we all thought was going to be the end of the world, ended up being a pretty small fire. And yet the impacts that the fire had on the land were very significant. I think the impacts on the community were pretty significant too, because we all realized that we had just dodged a bullet. The fire was so hot that it caused granite boulders to shatter from the heat. Those holes in the ground are tree roots, where tree roots used to be from a now vanished tree. The tree burned so hot that it completely went up in smoke and flames and left holes in the ground marking where the roots had been. So the fire was enormously, powerfully destructive. This is a view right up at the saddle up by the top of Shadow Canyon, and you can see it was a landscape that almost looked lunar. It looked like walking on the surface of the moon in the aftermath of the fire, because it burned so hot. It took the trees' needles off, it took everything, killed the trees, and burned all of the ground underneath it. It burned up all the vegetation, and even killed a lot of the roots and seeds that would have been present in the soil. So at the time, initially, we thought, oh my gosh, the city just dodged a bullet, but this beautiful land up at the top of Shadow Canyon and on the top of our mountains has been badly, badly damaged by fire. And as the smoke started to clear, we all started going back in there to do an inventory to see what had happened. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take you on a virtual nature hike of what I found when I went back into the area of the Flagstaff Fire 6 weeks after the burn. And what I found blew my mind. I hope what I'm going to tell you is going to pass your 4-way test here. I hope that it's something that will be interesting to all of you, and I'm hoping that it will change some of your perceptions of what wildfires do to the land. Because we're having a lot more wildfires in Colorado and in the West, and having a better understanding of what wildfires do and how they function from an ecological perspective is really important for all of us. So I grabbed my camera and I walked up there and went into the burn area 6 weeks later when they, it wasn't even open to the public. I got a special permit from the Open Space Department and went up to check it out. The first thing that I noticed when I got up there was how green everything was. Even 6 weeks after the fire, a huge amount of vegetation was already coming back. The trees were dead, but a lot of the understory plants, a lot of the shrubs, a lot of the wildfires just picked right back up out of the ashes and started to grow again. So when I went up there and started walking around, big chunks of the landscape, this lunar landscape, had green plants coming back up out of them, growing like crazy. Sprouts everywhere pushing up out of the ashes. Things that had been maybe seeds in the soil that weren't killed by the heat, or plants that had deep, deep root systems that survived the heat and came right back. The soil had been fertilized with a lot of extra nitrogen from all of the ash, and so the plants that survived, or the plants that sprouted, were actually having excellent growing conditions and were growing very quickly. This is fireweed. It's a plant that you frequently find after a fire. This is 6 weeks after the Flagstaff Fire had completely torched this area. You can see burnt trees and rocks covered with the slurry retardant that was dropped from the plains. This area had been an inferno 6 weeks before, and we already had the fireweed coming back and blooming. It wasted no time.
It's like Barbara's on this. Did you send her a link?
There's a Rocky Mountain maple that was resprouting from the roots. And all over the place, as I looked, I found things coming back. The spreading dogbane had come back full force and was blooming already, and the landscape was covered with it and covered with butterflies. There were all sorts of butterflies flying around in the spreading dogbane, nectaring off of the flowers as the ecosystem came back. It was truly remarkable to walk through there because, you know, some of the pictures I showed you at the beginning made you know, I said it was a landscape that looked like you were on the moon. And yet the place was noisy with animal life. Everywhere I could hear the sounds of grasshoppers, I could hear birds singing. There were woodpeckers busy in all of the dead trees. There's so many woodpeckers up there, and they were flaking the black, burnt, charred bark off the trees looking for little crispy insects that had been under the bark that had been toasted into little crispy McNuggets for the woodpeckers. And in a lot of the trees weren't even black anymore. The woodpeckers had been so active, they'd flipped all of those blackened bits of bark off, and a lot of the trees were red again because all of the black had been stripped off by the woodpeckers. They were very, very active up there. I saw Steller's jays. I had a Cooper's hawk fly over. There were ravens up there, a lot of little birds foraging around. And as I said already, butterflies and grasshoppers. It was a very, very alive forest, despite the fact that I was walking through something that looked like the moon. And then one of my friends went up into the very same area and took this photograph. This is a very, very rare woodpecker called the three-toed woodpecker. I've only seen a couple of them in my entire life. They are fire specialists, and they travel all over the West like nomads, looking for places that have recently and catastrophically burned. And the three-toed woodpeckers will move into those areas for maybe a year or two, hang out, raise chicks, take advantage of the dead trees, and then take off and move on to the next fire. The only time I've ever seen three-toed woodpeckers in my life is in recently burned catastrophic fires. And sure enough, they were present up on Flagstaff Mountain because their unique habitat requirements are only met by that kind of a blaze. Still walking around up there, there were parts of the forest that were devastated. This was the sort of a thing, you know, these trees were just blackened sticks. They were never going to return. It was impressive. to see that. And yet, right next to where I took this photo, right at the top of the saddle at Shannon Canyon, I found this. Those are aspens. Aspens are tough survivor trees. They're almost like trash trees in a way. And the aspens had originally been growing there a long time ago, and as the pines grew up, the pines sort of took over and drove the aspens down underground and suppressed the aspens. And the aspens that existed there, maybe for decades, as roots down under the pine trees. And they were just waiting their turn. And when we had the fire come through, and the Flagstaff Fire stripped out all of the pine trees, the aspens are like, oh yeah, now it's our time. Yeah, we're back. And 6 weeks later, they're already a foot tall and growing like weeds. And so my prediction is that the fire destroyed a lot of the pine trees up there. It didn't kill the ecosystem, it just changed it. And so where we formerly had a pine forest, we're now going to have an aspen grove in the future, and the aspen grove will probably persist for a number of decades until little by little over time the pines gradually start muscling the aspens out of the way and gradually take over and turn that back into a pine forest, and it will continue that way until we have the next big fire up there, and then nature will push the reset button and we'll have an aspen grove again. Maybe do a lot of thinking about what you see when you go up to the top of a burned area like this. This is from the top of Bear Peak, looking over that saddle. Let's see if I can get the laser to work here. Where that picture with the aspen was taken right down there. And so then I climb back up the ridge here to the peak, and I'm looking back over, and you can see where the fire burned all across South Boulder Peak here. But when I look at this photograph, as an ecologist, one of the things I'm seeing is that we've got a whole mix of different kinds of conditions in there now after the fire. We've got some areas here where the burn was very, very intense. We've got some areas here where the burn wasn't so intense. These trees here got toasted, but a lot of them will survive. On the other hand, some of them are going to die and turn into dead standing trees. Anybody know what likes dead standing trees in the forest? Woodpeckers, bats, fungi, insects. Wildlife biologists have a saying that a tree is more alive after it's dead, because a dead standing tree turns into an animal apartment building. The woodpeckers will move in, following the buds. After the tree is filled with insects, the woodpeckers will come and start feeding on it. The wood will get softened up by fungi and insects working on it until the woodpeckers can make nests in it. They'll dig holes in the tree where they'll raise their offspring. And when the woodpeckers move on, other kinds of animals will move into the old woodpecker holes, like bats will roost in there, or little nuthatches and tree swallows aren't able to dig their own holes, but they'll use old woodpecker holes in the dead trees. And in wintertime, little birds like chickadees and nuthatches will take refuge in those old woodpecker holes in the dead trees to get away from the cold. They'll all pack in like sardines to share body heat down inside that old woodpecker hole on those sub-zero nights. And so dead trees are really important for the wild habitat of a forest. And in fact, this fire provided quite a few of them. Here's another view of that, and you can see all of the different conditions there. So let's imagine an ice cream parlor for a second, and let's imagine you go to an ice cream store and all I got is vanilla. Oh boy. Well, you know, you get your vanilla cone, but what we had before the fire was a vanilla forest. It was all the same. It was pretty much the same kind of trees in the same stage of their life, one habitat type, one flavor. After the fire came in and mixed things up, nature's reset button, we ended up with many different kinds of habitat here, many different flavors. And so the fire created a much richer post-environment with all of the dead trees, with places where some of the trees were injured, but they'll become homes for certain kinds of insects and fungi that will bring certain kinds of animals that come to eat them. You've still got the untouched forest here. You've got the blackened forest up here that's a totally different ecosystem type. You might find aspens moving in here. You might find grasslands moving in there. What we can say for sure is that the fire really reset the ecosystem. It was like nature shuffled all the cards and everybody got a new hand. And in the wake of a fire, you have winners and losers. The pine trees here that burned intensely were clearly some of the losers, but the aspens were winners. The woodpeckers were winners. The bats and the tree swallows are going to be winners, and clearly the spreading dogbane, or the butterflies, came right back. They weren't even really slowed down that much by the fire. So when you see a disturbance event like this, like a big fire, and you see this kind of a patchy distribution in the aftermath, think to yourself, wow, we've just created a lot of different kinds of habitat in the wake of the fire. We've created an ice cream parlor with a lot of different flavors in it. I'm going to show you another picture here. We're going to go back in time even farther. We're going to go back in time almost 50 years for this picture. This was taken in 1974. And see if you notice any similarities. That's taken looking back from Walker Ranch in the area where I was just showing you. It was this slope up in here was where the big fire burned. But 50 years previous, standing at Walker Ranch and looking back towards Bear Peak and South Boulder Peak, you saw this. That's not fire. What would have killed all those dead trees? Pine beetle. Mountain pine beetle. We had a big pine beetle epidemic in the 70s. That took out vast chunks of the pine forest. But now look at this picture again, and remember what I just said about patchy distribution. What do you see? Did it kill every tree? Well, what I see here are patches where you might be able to get some aspens moving in, where you get some trees that are dead here that will, again, attract a certain kind of insect. It will attract certain kinds of animals that come to eat those insects. It'll provide a certain kind of an ecosystem or habitat. And then up here you have something different, and in here you have something different. This didn't get touched. When we have mountain pine beetles move through ponderosa pine, like what we have right here in the Boulder area, we get a patchy distribution that, boy, sure looks a lot like what we saw at the end of the wildfire. What we get is something that's a natural change agent that acts, again, as nature's reset button and creates a lot of different opportunities for a lot of different species. Ecologists love to throw the term biodiversity around. Biodiversity simply refers to how many different species do you have packed into this one area. And a place like a tropical rainforest would have very, very high biodiversity. If you take an acre, you'll find thousands of different species packed into an acre of tropical rainforest. In a mature ponderosa pine forest, like this green stuff here, the biodiversity is a lot lower. And when the whole mountain is covered with that, you don't have that much biodiversity in the area because you only have one habitat type. Following a disturbance event like pine beetles or a wildfire, you get all of these patches that actually drive the biodiversity that we all love so much. It's part of what makes the Front Range such an incredible spot. You know, we're one of the highest and got some of the highest biodiversity in the United States in the Front Range. We have the fourth highest biodiversity of breeding butterflies, and Boulder County has the highest diversity in all of Colorado of breeding birds. And it's in part because of these sorts of disturbance events that create an ice cream parlor filled with many, many different flavors, so that no matter who you are, you can find something in the Boulder area that provides a habitat. I'm going to show you another picture. We're going to jump, we're still going to be back in time, but we're going to jump to 2013. What happened in 2013? 9 years ago, almost this week, you had a big flood. And here's, this is up by the Dowdy Draw Trail. After the flood, I was out, again, just a few weeks after the flood, just taking a look at the damage. And when I saw this scene, I realized that damage isn't the word that I wanted to use to describe what I see here. Damage is what natural disasters do to human infrastructure and people's lives. If your house burned down in a fire, that's damage. If the flood caused the mountain to slide down and take your house out, that's damage. But in fact, what you see in this picture isn't damage at all. It's natural ecosystem change. And look again at the patchiness of the aftermath of disaster. You've got all different kinds of habitats, including scoured creek bed. After the flood of 2013, we saw the first wild germination of native cottonwood trees in decades, because wild cottonwood trees need scoured creek bed. And we had interrupted the flood cycle with irrigation ditches and dams. And humans don't like floods. We don't like natural disasters very much. Who likes having their house burned down in a fire? Who likes having a flood take out their home? Nobody likes that kind of stuff. And yet, from a natural point of view, having this flood come through and scour everything provided opportunities for new cottonwood forests to sprout for the first time in probably about 80 years as a result of the flood. Winners and losers. The flood created all these landslides. Within, just like by the next spring, these were covered over again with grass and wildflowers and turned back into meadows. If you go and hike up there in this area 9 years later, you won't even see these things, these big scars that looked so catastrophic at the time. They're completely covered over and have just blended right back into the hillside. It made me realize when we go on a hike, how many places we walk where we're not aware of the previous natural disasters that happened. We don't see the landslides, we don't see the floods, the fires, the pine beetle epidemics, because nature recovers and nature always wins. Even places like this, if you go back there today, this is up by Lee Hill Canyon, and you can see what looks like utter devastation on the part of the creek, which is the creek digging itself a new bed. It's happened thousands of times over the last million years, and it will probably happen another 1,000 times over the upcoming million years. And we humans, our generation, just had the fortune, good or bad, to actually witness it and see one of these natural processes taking place, the kind of process that drives ecosystem change and drives biodiversity. Oh, I just lost there we go. So I guess the take-home message I want you to go away with is that ecosystems change over time, and frequently nature's mechanisms are catastrophic events like fires, floods, things like the Flagstaff Fire. This is the Marshall Fire that just started in last December, on December 30th. This is the destructive fire that burned large parts of Superior and Louisville. In May, I went out and walked the area to see what had happened, and this is a photograph that I took in the wake of the Marshall Fire that was so destructive. Nature comes back, nature is infinitely resilient, and nature always wins. And so when you think about these events, next time we have the pine beetle epidemic, next time we have the fire, next time it feels like your heart is going to break, remember this picture and remember the flowers that come back in the wake of the fire, and remember how that is what drives the ecosystem changes that creates the world that we all love so much. Thanks very much, and I'll take questions.
Hello? Yep.
Yes, sir.
Oh, I've got it right here. Sorry.
Sir, when I drive up into the mountains, say around Aspen and so many places, I see acres and acres, thousands of acres of trees that are all apparently dead. What's going to happen and what's it going to look like when the lightning hits at the right time?
So when you drive up to Aspen and you see those acres and acres of dead trees, you're mostly seeing lodgepole pine forests that were killed by mountain pine beetle. Lodgepole pine behaves differently as an ecosystem than ponderosa pines. And so what happened up in the high country looks absolutely devastating because when lodgepole pine stands go, they all go at the same time. It's either like something like a catastrophic fire or catastrophic pine beetle epidemic that takes out literally thousands, or in the case of the pine beetle epidemic, over 1 million acres of trees. It looks terrifying, but again, it's a natural disturbance event. What's going to happen up there is you got to give it a little bit of time, but the first thing that's going to happen is a lot of those areas with the dead trees are going to turn back into grasslands and meadows, which are really, really good places for a lot of different kinds of grazing wildlife. So in the absence of the trees, as the grasses and wildflower take in, we'll get more elk, we'll get more deer, and more deer and elk means more mountain lions, more predators coming to eat them, and it just kind of ramps the whole ecosystem up by shifting it in another direction. The other thing we're going to see is a lot of those places are going to be replaced with aspen groves. And so if you drive through a lot of pine beetle kill areas, you'll see the little aspens. Now, maybe they're at 8 or 9 years old, So the aspen trees only look this big, and you don't really see them as being aspens yet, but give them another decade or two, and then we'll all be driving up to those pine beetle areas to go see the beautiful aspens change, and within 30 or 40 years, we'll probably all have forgotten about the pine beetle epidemic anyway, because nature will take its course, replace those ecosystems with something else, and then the lodgepole pines will start to return, and those aspen groves and those meadows are going to start filling back in with baby lodgepole pines, all about the same age, all about the same size, and they'll all grow together, and you'll get another dense lodgepole pine forest in, say, 150 years, that will just be waiting for the next reset event. And then in 150 years, there'll be another big fire or another big pine beetle epidemic that will just take out all of those lodgepole pines again, and the whole cycle will start over again. Humans, we think maybe in terms of generations, maybe 10 or 20 years. We don't think in terms of cycles that take 2 or 3 centuries to complete themselves. And what happened with the pine beetle and the big pine beetle kill in the high country is part of a cycle that runs on 1.5 centuries to 2 centuries. And we just happened to see one particular phase of it that's literally scared the hell out of us. I sympathize with people who own property up there and who bought a beautiful house with a view of the pine forest, because then they watch the view all die. If they're patient and they'll wait, they'll watch that view turn back into a meadow or aspens or something, and it will be beautiful again, because nature will always reset it. One other thing I want to say about the pine beetle and the lodgepole pine is that a lot of people were very worried about the danger of wildfire in the wake of the pine beetle epidemic because of all the dead trees. It hasn't happened. We've had a couple of bad fires, but typically what predicts a bad fire year is drought and low snowfall and early snowmelt. There isn't a statistical correlation over the years between pine beetle epidemic events and wildfire. Once all those needles fall off the tree, you've got a bunch of dead standing logs. Try to imagine starting a fire with a bunch of logs in your fireplace without any kindling. It's really hard. You can't just burn a log, and that's pretty much what you've got is vertical logs up there that aren't going to easily catch fire, and they're not going to easily spread the fire from one tree to another. I'm not saying it can't happen, but statistically the chances of getting big catastrophic wildfires aren't related to pine beetle kill. It just doesn't add up, and if you look at the last 10 years, we haven't had a lot of those big fires that people were predicting, and all of those pine beetle areas, they haven't burned down like we thought they would.
So,
yes.
Actually, I got the microphone. I'll pass the microphone to you in just a sec. Can you comment on climate change? I mean, you were saying that, nature always wins, and in a way, I think nature is going to win with climate change too, but I guess my concern is, in light of what we're seeing with climate change, is that impacting the way nature would normally respond?
That's a really good question, and it's something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. Nature does always win, and nature will win in the case of climate change. I'm not sure that the human species will win in the case of climate change. That to me is debatable, but nature is going to definitely pull something out of this. This isn't the first time that climate changed. This is the first time that human beings have caused a climate change event, but the climate has changed over and over and over again. We've had 5 ice ages in the last 2 million years, each of them being a very, very intense change to very, very cold conditions, followed by rapid warming and drying, and global warming, followed by another ice age, followed by another global warming event. So this is nothing new to nature, and it has survived all of those other global warming events, and it will survive this one too. But one of the things that I think is happening, and this is my own idea, so I'm going to preface it that way, but when I'm looking at all of the wildfires out in California, I'm looking at the flood of 2013, I'm looking at how I think climate change is shifting patterns of heat. It's shifting where the rain falls, it's shifting the climate, literally. So some areas are becoming cooler, some areas are becoming hotter, some areas are becoming wetter, some areas are becoming drier. Each one of those places where you find local conditions changing means that the ecosystem that exists there right now is suddenly having its preferred sweet spot of conditions change on it. And ecosystems change over time. And so what I think is happening, say, in California, is we've got a bunch of forests that have been growing there in a stable ecosystem for thousands of years based on what the climate used to be. And now we're getting a new normal. Nature is, because the climate's warming, nature is going to replace those ecosystems with something that's stable for the new normal. And what we're seeing in those fires is we're seeing what that process looks like. We're seeing nature cleaning up the old ecosystem that humans have become familiar with. And because we don't think in terms of millennia, it's the ecosystem that's always been there. But from nature's point of view, it's just the ecosystem that happens to be there today. And nature will gladly clean it up with fires or pine beetles or some other sort of a disturbance event and replace it with something that's stable for the new normal. And that's going to happen all over the planet. And one of the things that's we're going to see right here in Boulder is we're going to see as our climate here warms and dries, particularly in the summer, we're going to see a lot of the plants and animals that we're familiar with down on the plains start to move up more into the mountains, and the band where you find the ponderosa pines is going to move up, following its sweet spot up the mountain, and then you're going to find the layer above that with the lodgepole pines. It's going to move up the mountain too. So all these ecosystems are going to shift vertically up the side of the mountain. But when that happens, it's going to be unpleasant because people don't like change. And the Marshall Fire that burned all of those ponderosa pines in the grassland out at Marshall, when I saw that, what I said was, this is how it starts. This is what it's going to look like. We're seeing an area that had formerly been ponderosa pine forest get turned back into a grassland because a lot of the trees burnt. That is just nature adapting to a new climate reality. And that's what I think we're going to see all over the place. Species will go extinct. We may lose penguins and polar bears as a result of climate change. That'll open up niches that more new species in the future will evolve to fill.
Is there any causal connection between the 2012 fire here and the 2013 flood?
That's an excellent question. I don't believe so, because the 2012 fire was all on the backside of the mountain, so any water that would have hit there would have slid off down the back and around the back into South Boulder Creek. And so I don't think it probably had that much to do with it, but it may have had a little effect of a little extra water getting into South Boulder Creek. Where I think we saw more of an effect was the 4 Mile fire that burned up above Lee Hill Road, and that was up on county open space property. It burned a lot of houses up there, and then that was also in 2012, and then we had a lot of rainfall up there in that watershed, and it came down that little itty-bitty tiny trickle of water called 4 Mile Canyon Creek and blew it out into a 4,000 cubic foot per second monster that took out houses. It went all the way down across North Boulder. And I think that was in part due to the fact that it was falling on a very large, very recently burned area. The 4 Mile fire was much bigger than this dinky little 300-acre thing up on Bear Peak. And so we're just not talking about the kind of acreage that's going to have that much of an effect. But boy, oh boy, did we ever see runoff coming down out of, the Wagon Wheel Gap Road. That was all runoff coming out of the area where the 4 Mile fire had burned.
We have one question online with Merrill, and this will be our last question because we only have a couple of minutes. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Are you hearing me okay, David?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great. I'm actually in a vast deciduous forest in New York State, upper New York. So we'll have to save that for another lecture. And also wanted to throw in that when Leslie and I drive through a beetle-killed area in Colorado Mountains, Leslie's developed a philosophy. Instead of tearing up because it's so devastating, she focuses on the few trees that are alive and green. And it's really a great psychological mechanism for taking into account the pine bark killer. But my question is essentially, last year we drove through the Hayman fire scar. And this year we've seen the Marshall fire. And the Hayman fire scar had hardly any regeneration. I mean, it was just like it happened yesterday. Whereas the Marshall fire, we're seeing a lot of regeneration. And my question is, why the difference? What's your analysis?
There are probably a couple of different things going on there. One of the things that I think happened is that much of what burned at Marshall was a grassland fire, and so there wasn't nearly as much fuel. Grassland, it's like burning shredded paper. It burns very fast, it burns very hot, but very briefly. And so the fire moved very quickly, pushed by those intense winds. But if you were an individual particular patch of soil, you were only on fire for a very, very brief amount of time, and it didn't give the heat much of an opportunity to penetrate deep into the soil. It just sort of like gave the land a haircut. And a lot of the plant roots that are present in the grassland plants, they go down 10 or 12 feet. And a little fire like the Marshall Fire, they just laugh at it. It really is like getting a haircut. Most of the plant exists under the soil, and it was completely untouched. And so all it took was a little bit of rain in the spring, and boom! I'm leading hikes out at Marshall Mesa. I'm taking people out there and showing them what it looks like after the fire. And in the grassland areas, you cannot see what burned and what didn't. You can't find the land just casually, looking there. You cannot find where that line is. It all looks like completely recovered grassland. But in the forested areas, and what I think happened in the Hayman fire was because there's so much more fuel, the heat gets much more intense and it lasts a lot longer. And the Hayman fire was a very, very intense, superheated fire. It probably generated temperatures well in excess of 1,000 degrees when it was burning. Like some of the very, very worst parts of the fire up on Bear Peak and the Flagstaff Fire. And sometimes when you have fires that intense, it can sterilize the soil. It can chemically change the soil to make it hard for new plants to grow in it. It can kill roots deep, deep down in the soil. So maybe the aspens were all killed if the heat penetrated deeply enough. And I've heard of cases where there's soil that has a lot of clay content in it, and those kinds of intense temperatures are like what you find in a kiln. They can actually fire the clay in the soil and make it impermeable to water. So there may be things happening in these super intense burns like that. I didn't even get into how our fire management policy has made fires like the Hayman fire almost a certainty, but fires didn't used to be as intense as they are now. And the Hayman fire was a particularly intense example of a modern fire that did not follow the sort of the normal ecological pattern you would ordinarily find in a fire. It was way more intense and way hotter as a result of people allowing the trees to grow in there way too densely.
David, thank you so much. Thanks so much for your presentation to us today and for broadening our perspective on what we always consider a disaster, that sometimes our focus is too narrow and that we need to be thinking that nature has a way of tending toward life and that it does restore itself. I was a witness to what you were talking about this summer when we drove down to Durango, went over Wolf Creek Pass, a trip we used to make frequently. And 10 years ago, I remember just thinking, this is just, the landscape has been devastated. And I can't imagine that it will ever come back in my lifetime. And this year, as I was a passenger in the vehicle, I had a chance to really look at the landscape around me. And what I saw were little lodgepole pines coming back and aspens, stands of green aspen trees that I hadn't seen there before. So it is a positive way to look at what we sometimes see as solely disastrous. You may or may not know that Rotary International has adopted the environment as one of its major areas of focus. Another area of focus that Rotary's been involved in for the past 35 plus years has been the eradication of polio. And in your honor, we are going to donate 100 doses of vaccine to the polio eradication campaign. Thank you so much.